Hello and welcome to the World University Summit on the theme of Universities of the Future, a global partnership for social justice and sustainable development. But our topic today is a very interesting, a very relevant of the world which we are inhabiting right now as we are speaking is on academic freedom. Before I get on with the discussion, let me quickly introduce our panelists. And we'll maintain the sequence while speaking. That's Professor Jane Falkingham, a professor of demography and international social policy and vice president, international and global engagement at the University of Southampton. Professor Karen O'Brien joined Durham University as vice chancellor and warden in January 2022, having led the humanities division of the University of Oxford for 5 years previously. Professor LYNN PASQUERELLA was appointed president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities in 2016 after serving as the 80th president of Mount Holyoke College. And Professor Michael Spence, AC, joined UCL as president provost in January 2021, joining the university from the University of Sydney, where he was vice chancellor from 2008 to 2020. I am not going into the detailed biographies of our panelists so that we can save some time to deliberate on what today's topic is. A quick introduction really is academic freedom. I mean, can't be overstressed really. I mean, we need more academic freedom than anything else. Is the basic tenet for flourishing of any university. And it has been one of the first principles from the beginning of universities, the idea of universities really. And such freedom is best fostered within democratic environments that allow diverse opinions and viewpoints to flourish through critical thinking and open dialogue. Yet we know very well that academic freedom is under severe challenge in most countries around the globe. I think more than half the world's population reside in countries where there is little or no academic freedom. In the last 1 year, only 4 countries actually have shown some improvement in academic freedom, and that is 0.7% of the world's population. Gambia, Kazakhstan, Seychelles, countries which are really small. So the big countries are really not pulling up their socks. For example, the UK, I think, is 60th in the world, well below all EU nations. And these are, of course, based on some calculations done by various agencies. I am quoting the VM index out here for academic freedom. Now, this is not just the case within non-democratic nations, but also, and this is what is alarming, but also within countries known for holding free and fair elections and being large democracies like India, my country, and the United States of America. Normatively, within academic institutions, the vice chancellor or the president should be the first among equals. But this situation has changed drastically since the emergence of the market-oriented entrepreneurial universities. Thus, the idea of democratic leadership and its relation to academic freedom can be considered at 2 levels: universities within democracies and universities following a shared governance model. During the session, I hope we will focus on the implications of these dynamics for universities' mission of fostering intellectual inquiry, creating critical knowledge, preparing students for informed citizenship. I mean, we won't go into the definitions of what freedom of speech or academic freedom is, but I will, request all our participants to maybe make their opening few sentences, lines, and then we go into a discussion really. So, we start with Professor Falkingham to take us through what she understands by academic freedom and how she has been involved in really fostering that idea.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me today. Thank you to Professor Raj Kumar and to Professor KISHALAY. I'm really delighted to be part of this distinguished panel. And I also wish to pass on my sincere apologies and also my warm greetings from my Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mark E. Smith, for whom I'm standing in today. He unfortunately was called to an urgent meeting in London with the Minister. So I've stepped into his shoes, which is always a task. The panel is very timely, though, as many universities throughout the globe are reimagining and rethinking academic freedom and what it means for their communities. And I think because I'm the first speaker from the UK, perhaps I'll just indulge me for a little bit just to bring you up to date of what's been happening in the UK. So there's been a very lively debate here for the last 3 to 4 years around the meaning of freedom of speech and academic freedom, as we've got a new Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which has been debated in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and then was passed into legislation receiving royal assent just in May 2023. And we're now, all the universities are really thinking through what that new act means for us. The act strengthens the university's duty to promote freedom of speech and academic freedom. And I think this is a particular change. So the previous Higher Education Act, we had a duty to protect freedom of speech and academic freedom. Now we have a duty to promote. And I think that is a difference and a nuance that we need to think through. We're also required to develop codes of practice, which we have to bring to the attention of all of our students at least once a year. But also, interestingly, our students' union also now have to think very carefully around what freedom of speech means. And I think particularly because I'm talking at an OP Jindal event, and I know OP Jindal is a seat of learning, particularly in law. I think your roots came from starting in law. The Act introduces for the first time a statutory tort whereby individuals can actually bring civil proceedings against a union, students' union, or a university if they think that their university has breached their duty to freedom of speech and academic freedom. So in thinking about developing our new code of practice, we've really concentrated at the University of Southampton to develop a shared understanding of our institution's values and expectations around freedom of speech and academic freedom, and also developing an open and transparent framework of how these will be developed in practice so that everybody understands, staff and students, and indeed visiting speakers. What we're aiming for is to ensure that everyone can express their viewpoint within the law. But of course, we are governed by a set of laws which go beyond freedom of speech. I think, as Professor KISHALAY said, it's fundamental that the fundamental right of freedom of speech is an essential part of academic freedoms, and really thinking about how we pursue knowledge. If we are not free to research or to debate without interference or penalty, then how will we pursue knowledge? And it's only through discussion or vigorous debate that knowledge is advanced. So 400 years ago, for example, the debate around whether the world was flat or round, we were allowed to debate that. And such debates moved us forward. And in my own area of demography, it's really important that students are exposed to ideas that maybe challenge their own thoughts. So there are many contentious issues within demography, difficult topics such as immigration, population growth, population control, and climate change. And not everybody agrees, for example, that immigration is beneficial for the receiving country. And not everybody agrees around issues such as the availability of contraception or abortion. But it's important that such issues are freely debated and alternative voices are heard. And I think I've used my 5 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. If I may request Professor Karen O'Brien, and you mentioned Professor FALKINGHAM about the Act, and I think it was last year when also the director for freedom of speech and academic freedom at the Office of Students was set up in your country, and it took the Tories 13 years into their time to enact that. I was wondering what whether it would have made any difference if it was enacted earlier, or if Labour wins the next election, will they abolish the post?
So is this to me?
Yeah, I'm just kind of,
Thank you. So, and
my
my thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here. My thanks to Professors KISHALAY and Kumar for the invitation. We were asked to make a few kind of preliminary remarks, specifically connecting academic freedom and democracy. So, picking up on those points, I might give a little bit of an overview in terms of my own background. I'm a historian of Europe. These issues have been around for very many centuries, and I think I might just start with a bit of a historical perspective in terms of universities that have played a role for both democracy and academic freedom. Specifically on the academic freedom point, I work on the Enlightenment, and specifically the notion of the Enlightenment as the pursuit of secular science unconstrained by religion or state interference. That's an 18th century idea, and it's an idea that was very important in terms of breaking academic freedom out from the constraints of censorship. And it coincided with the development of something we would recognize as modern universities. So the Humboldtian idea of the German university, the University of Berlin, the great era of the Scottish universities and the Scottish Enlightenment, the ways in which American universities in that period ceased to be simply theological colleges, and the export of that model of the university to colonial sites. And all of this was before the development of democracy. So freedom of speech, academic freedom, and democracy are not coterminous. Democracy in the modern sense of popular sovereignty through universal franchise linked to nation building and national independence is clearly a 19th century idea. And I think the convergence of democracy and academic freedom is still a work in progress in terms of how we think of ourselves as universities and how we bring those things together. We do, of course, as universities here in Durham and throughout many democracies, promote understandings of pluralistic democracy and the tolerance and inclusion necessary to promote that vision of democracy. But I think we're still underconfident in terms of how we understand ourselves structurally as corporate entities within a democratic system. And I think the time has come in the world we are today with a democracy under severe challenge that we sharpen our narrative of democratic value relative to academic freedom. To give you one idea, many of us are signatories to the Magna Charta Universitatum, which is was a charter signed in the late 90s and is currently signed up to by 950 universities, pledging institutional autonomy and academic freedom. An enormous number of those universities not remotely situated in democratic systems, and the Magna Charta Observatory having a very interesting debate about all of that. Coming specifically to the UK, as you heard from Jane, all universities here are established by Royal Charter, and yet in respect of our democratic obligations, we're highly regulated, and we've latterly been more regulated by this new freedom of speech legislation. One of the changes that Jane didn't mention that I think is important with that legislation is that it positions academic freedom, which is really an employment right of academics, within a wider framework of freedom of speech. So there's a kind of subsuming of something we used to separate a bit more of academic freedom within freedom of speech. And we really need to think about the implications of that. You've asked us to think about what we do as leaders in this very challenging and interesting environment. And I think that's something we've been thinking about a lot. We've been talking a great deal about the Calvin principles. I don't think our university or any university adheres narrowly to those. I think we speak plainly on political and social justice matters that are of direct relevance to us as universities, whether that's about inclusion, access to university, or whether that's about funding. We tend to be very outspoken in the UK and in very active dialogue with our political masters. But we nevertheless do think of ourselves as leaders, as people who create buffer zones around our academic staff and our students so that they may speak from their expertise and they may speak about the ideas that they have in an atmosphere where they're protected and where they have a measure of tolerance for their views. One thing I think we are trying to do and could do a lot more of is to focus on freedom of speech and academic freedom in qualitative terms, recognizing that although all freedom of speech within the law within Europe, certainly within the UK, is equally free, it is not equally valid, it is not equally insightful, it is not equally considered, it is not equally free from cliche, and it's not equally grounded in evidence. And that's where, as university leaders, we have to stand up for our staff and our students when they speak from a qualitative point of view, or into when we think about what high quality freedom of speech is and how that quality is repeatedly eroded by the soundbite, the retweet, the poor quality blog. What we're trying to do at Durham is to promote a notion of civility in our freedom of speech and academic freedom, forms of interaction, both what is said, but also in what context is said, that promotes a higher quality of dialogue and that recognizes that freedom of speech, as John Stuart Mill said back in the 19th century, is developmental for all concerned. And we are trying to promote a democratic culture of civil discourse internally within this university and within the UK. The other thing I think we're all doing, which is very interesting, is thinking about academic freedom and democracy in transnational terms. And I think here, university presidents and universities have an increasing and important role to play in forming stronger alliances, both between those universities that are located in democracies, but also those universities that are struggling to have a free and uncensored voice in undemocratic settings. All universities are differently constituted. In much of Europe, university staff are civil servants. Here we're in a different setting, but nevertheless, I think that transnational dialogue has become increasingly important as democracy has come under global pressure. We have a framework within which we conduct a lot of that dialogue, increasingly around the strategic development goals, the SDGs. They're giving us a framework to talk about the social justice issues that we want to talk about in a transnational way. But I think, as Jane alluded to, we nevertheless need to get sharper about the ways in which those goals conflict, the ways in which that SDG dialogue is itself contested and needs to be more overtly debated. We have one university in our transnational network, Uppsala University, that's setting up a fantastic institute for sustainability, specifically devoted to conflicts of goals. And I think that's, you know, in a transnational frame and in dialogue with Uppsala and other universities, that's a brilliant development. So I think we are committed to the Humboldtian idea of transnational citizenship and autonomy, but we're also committed to a democratic rights-based idea of freedom of speech as an entitlement, and it's never been more important that as leaders we stand up for those two things.
Thanks so much. Professor Pasquerella, if I may ask you for your opening remarks, also to remind our audience and that, you know, over the last 3 months, 4 months, we've seen an absolutely tumultuous developments across the globe, you know, starting from my own country and spreading across to various other countries of how student demonstrations to classroom in teaching are being scrutinized and even silenced around the whole discussion of what's happening in Israel-Palestine. I mean, it seems as if that there is not even room for mourning for the dead. So, I mean, you know, I was thinking that I'd like to listen to what you have to say about that, as I'm going to come to others as also with the Israel-Palestine thing, because that's the most current burning thing before us, and how the campuses have really reacted and responded to it.
Yeah, the reaction certainly lends a new sense of urgency to this topic of democratic leadership and academic freedom in higher education. And it's an urgency that I have felt as president of an association that is dedicated to advancing the democratic purposes of higher education by promoting equity, innovation, and excellence in liberal education. So let me talk a bit about the backdrop against which these campus activities are unfolding. In the US, the deepening ideological divides and burgeoning levels of polarization and partisanship, fueled by escalating culture wars, have contributed to a flurry of legislation culminating in educational gag orders, restricting discussions around race, racism, gender, LGBTQ+ identities, reproductive rights, the banning of books from public libraries that address these topics, even in a historical context, efforts to eliminate tenure and terminate tenured professors, legislative overreach into the appointment and removal of campus leaders, the imposition of ideologically driven civics institutes and general education curricula that are rooted in the values, quote, of the Western tradition, the elimination of critical race theory, gender studies, ethnic studies courses from the curriculum, and mandates to measure the economic value and opportunity costs of academic programs at public universities that would require state institutions to prioritize graduating students with degrees in high-paying jobs that lead to immediate employability in high-paying jobs. So at risk is the distinctively American tradition of liberal education, foundational to our nation's historic mission of educating for democracy. And while this certainly isn't the first time that state-ordered ideology has been used to undermine academic freedom on college and university campuses, the current proliferation of efforts by legislators, governors, governing boards is alarming in its nature and scope. The strength of American higher education is derived in part from the fact that what's taught inside and outside of our classrooms is protected from direct government control and undue political influence. And this current politicization of higher education jeopardizes both higher education and our republic. So we know that preparing students for work, citizenship, and life in a globally interdependent, multicultural world necessitates exposure to diverse perspectives alongside practicing humanistic identification with people from different backgrounds. And this is something that my colleague Tony Carnevale, who runs the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce, chronicled in a 2020 report, The Role of Higher Education in Taming Authoritarian Attitudes, where he offers evidence as to why academic freedom and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are so vital to higher education's overall mission and purposes. So their study shows that liberal education, with its exposure to diverse contexts, histories, ideas, lifestyles, religions, cultures, and ways of life, counters authoritarian tendencies by reducing individuals' sensitivities to potential triggers, provides them with protection in the form of self-esteem, personal security, and autonomy, but it also enhances a sense of interpersonal trust that's associated with lower inclination toward expressing authoritarian attitudes and preferences. And we know that because democracies with higher levels of liberal education have greater levels of political tolerance and are more likely to survive, that higher education, the report concludes, grounded in academic freedom, is the cornerstone of successful democracies, not easily shaken by authoritarian threats. So in the US, the precipitous drop in academic freedom that was mentioned at the outset has been due primarily to a decline in campus integrity, defined as the extent to which campuses are free from politically motivated surveillance and can protect freedom of expression by academics on political issues. So these measures remind us that academic freedom implies not just freedom from constraint, but freedom for faculty and students to work within a scholarly community to develop the intellectual and personal characteristics, particularly the independent thought necessary for vibrant deliberative democracy. And that's the tension that we're seeing on college campuses as a result of the Hamas attack on Israel. How do we define what this means?
Thank you so much. Professor Spence, we know that, there are, even with the best efforts, there's persistent and widespread concerns that many in higher education are being silenced either by activity or by its inactivity. And that silencing can disproportionately really affect the most vulnerable. Students who might join the university eager to debate contentious issues about gender identity, or gay rights and Islamic law, the Black Lives Matter movement. But as a leader in academic institutions, what specific measures have you been able to implement to promote open dialogue, encourage diverse perspectives, and challenge conventional thinking? It is almost impossible, it seems, to be able to implement it. Like, right, I think one of our participants said that, now it's time to act, really. We know what it is. We've drafted and framed those policies, but, how do we implement it? Because it is hurting the students and the teachers.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to join you this morning. I think in order to address those particular issues, you have to think about the role of the university in a liberal democracy as what, the UCL philosopher Ronald Dworkin called a theatre for the exercise of the independence of the mind. And it's not enough just to think about academic freedom or freedom of speech. You have to think about what kind of community you're creating in the university, and in particular, how it lives up to its promise to be a genuinely pluralistic community. And that inevitably then raises questions about what diversity looks like, and I'll come back to that. UCL has a very particular history. It was founded as the third university in England at a time when you had to sign the 39 Articles of the Church of England to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And the notion was that for everybody to live together well, for you to build a strong community, everybody had to think the same thing. And the founders of University College London were very clear that that was not the case, that you could think radically different things and yet nevertheless live together well in community. And so they founded the university without that requirement of signing the 39 Articles. And what we've been thinking about lately is, what does that really mean for us as a community now? What does it mean to be a pluralistic community and to live together well? The kinds of issues that Karen was picking up on. And we've been thinking about that in quite practical ways. So, for example, if you have a gay Marxist sociologist and a Buddhist Marxist sociologist and a woman Marxist sociologist and a Black Marxist sociologist, do you have diversity in a meaningful sense for a university? What does it mean to avoid the narcissistic process of self-reproduction, which is academic hiring in most academic departments? What does it mean to recruit to diversity in the fullest sense? Then in the classroom, what are your pedagogic and epistemic duties to those positions with which you most disagree? Is it appropriate that a student ever knows what a teacher thinks about a particular issue? Or should she be set free to explore ideas to explore ideas that are presented, as it were, in their best light across the spectrum of views on a particular issue? What's the difference, therefore, between preaching and teaching? Should a classroom be a safe space? These are the sorts of questions that we've been addressing with staff, and underlying that is a conversation about what the epistemic virtues look like, and in particular, how you cultivate in a university community the virtue of epistemic humility, how you start the conversation with an assumption that you might be wrong, and that engagement in the conversation at the university will present you with the views of those who think that you are. And that's been, we've been doing that work very practically with staff in closed seminars, in more open seminars, in workshops of various kinds. But we've also begun a public engagement program around this whole idea of disagreeing well, of practicing the epistemic virtues in pluralistic communities to live together well, so precisely that institutions like universities can fulfill their democratic function. And what we've found is, not surprisingly, an extraordinary hunger for that activity. On our first public session, we didn't even really advertise it. We put a little notice on our website. 700 people turned up because our community is hungry to have the kind of conversation that makes deliberative democracy possible. And unfortunately, the kind of conversation that perhaps characterizes less the sort of political discourse that's going on in communities right across the world. So I think your question is, what do you have to do to create a community where everybody can be themselves? Not, as your question implied, the kind of community where you say, oh, isn't it lovely? We've got all these conservative Muslim students. That ticks the racial and ethnic and religious diversity box, but they better not say what they think about sexual ethics, because that would cross the LGBTQ box. But genuinely a community where everybody can be themselves. What does it mean to create a community where the epistemic virtues are practiced? That's what we think you need to do in order to have genuine free speech, and for the university to be the kind of place that can train people for participation in deliberative democracy.
Thanks so much. And now let's open up this conversation. We'll follow the same sequence. And, there was a study, I think, by King's College London last year, where actually 48% of 50%, let's say, of students said that they were avoiding inviting controversial, within quotes, speakers to their universities because it's getting very difficult for those events to get approved by the management. Now, this is something that I have heard from across the globe, that is the first thing where the universities, I mean, one of the premier institutions in India cancelled an important, eminent person's speech a couple of days back. And these are all, highly eminent people, and the institutions are right at the top of in the country in terms of academic freedom. But we see that there is a kind of a self-censorship that's happening. Is that something that you have been also observing and noticing, Professor Falkingham?
Thank you very much. So I'm probably sitting in a slightly different institution to my fellow colleagues from the UK, but I did spend the first 20 years of my academic life at the London School of Economics, which is a very different institution to the University of Southampton. Since I've been in Southampton, I would say that probably our student body are not as active as perhaps some of the London institutions, or indeed some of the more institutions with stronger arts and humanities and social science traditions. And so I am actually the member of the university executive board who the cases for invited speakers will come to, and I have not stopped a single one. But that's, of course, we don't know about the silences. We don't know if I'm not stopping them because they're not, they're self-censoring. But I think perhaps it's a less active institution, which then means that we actually have to do more. We actually, as the leaders of the institution, need to do more. So one of the things that I've been doing over the last 4 to 5 years is working with colleagues to actually put on a series of seminars which bring people together from outside of the university and to talk about different issues. So last year I was in conversation with Shabana Azmi and her husband, talking about their activities in India and their work with social justice and in human rights and the Mijuan welfare society. And then earlier this year, I again was in conversation with, I'm going to have to quickly look at my notes, Muna Abdul Salaman, who's one of the 500 most influential Muslims, named as one of the most 500 influential Muslims. And she again was on campus talking about gender and women's rights. So we're being proactive as a leadership to actually bring people onto campus to expose our students to some of these different views. I'm sure that probably Michael doesn't have that problem. He's got it the other way around. But in Southampton, we are trying to give our students the opportunities to listen to different voices, to hear different views, to get that understanding of different cultures, because that is actually fundamental.
Thank you. Professor Brian, while these issues were coming up, I recall a close friend of mine, a writer and an academic from across the road, actually in a university, was quoted in one article, and I thought it was beautiful the way she presented it, saying that the classroom should be like the mind. I mean, it should be open, because the mind does have controversies and contradictions and provocations, and the classroom should be able to accommodate all of it. But increasingly, we are told, and at least we get the sense from, and it's a universal thing, it's a phenomena, that be careful of how you speak in the classroom, of how you explain the classroom. I personally teach, the course that I offer in spring is actually I do reading violence through literature. Now, you know, the new system across academia, probably imported from the United States, was about trigger warning, which I learned after joining academia about 7 years back, which I'm a recovering broadcast journalist, and I kind of strayed into academia. And trigger warning, and I work on violence, and so I tell that, you know, I tell the students that the entire course is a trigger warning, but because I can't be giving you trigger warnings for every lecture that I give. And but more I hear from my peers, it seems every time I go into the class, I am being a little careful of how I am presenting a particular situation and scenario. Now, are we again, you know, I am going to kind of come back to it again and again and ask what each of you think about self-censorship, because that's how the authoritarian regime and the totalitarian regimes operate. It's not necessarily giving diktats, but actually creating an atmosphere and ecosystem where you are restraining yourselves. And I can see that happening even to myself.
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is the classroom is an effect of a wider social context in which I think people are more sensitive to the impact of the things that they may say, and they're certainly more sensitive to the fact that whatever they may say may be amplified and distorted on social media. So I think a factor of self-restraint and a contextual awareness is a reality in our democracy and in democracies across the world. And not all of that is necessarily a bad thing. You know, we often, as university leaders, will stand up for the right for people to give offence and be offended. But it isn't, you know, it's not a given that you would necessarily want to, and it's not a given that you'd necessarily want to set aside the rules of civility in all cases, although there are cases where respect and civility must be set aside in order to say what needs to be plainly said. So I think that's the wider social context in which we operate. Michael was talking about kind of operationalizing freedom of speech in pedagogical and academic contexts, and I think we certainly at Durham, and I know in most universities across Europe, think very long and hard about creating context, creating structures, encouraging students to deliberately take up opposing views to their own, different ways of structuring classroom dialogue that will break down that inhibition and ensure that we have good conversations. Now, that classroom does sound to me specifically like a social sciences or humanities classroom, and I think that is the challenge that Jane's alluding to. There are many different kinds of classroom in academia. I think the other thing is in kind of modelling an ideal classroom of free exchange and interchange, we forget two things. One, that under financial pressure in all of our systems in Europe, they tend to be overcrowded. So freedom of speech is about time to speak, and we don't always have the time and the space. That's one important thing. The second thing is recognising that we have highly international classrooms now in the UK and across the world and Australia and elsewhere, where there are students who come from regimes where whatever you say in the pedagogical context, their ability to speak entirely free on some topics is constrained by a concern for consequences back home. So we are navigating hugely complex international and national contexts in trying to create a space within classrooms for genuine dialogue and an ability, I think in LYNN's really good phrase, to encourage people to inhabit other perspectives in order to extend their kind of humanitarian sympathies. So it is a very difficult work in progress. I don't think universities have given up on their commitment to that epistemic pluralism, as Michael put it, but I think there are new factors. I think we kind of need to catch up with where we are as universities with international classrooms, constrained time, and a social atmosphere that is very shaped by social media.
Thanks. Professor Pasquerella, I mean, we would still be defining and explaining to students what freedom of speech, what academic freedom is. We would discuss and debate among ourselves, but is there also a time and space for some new imagination, absolutely new vocabulary to define that? I mean, are we satisfied with how it is defined? I mean, you know, I earlier asked Michael about how it's implemented. But if I take a step back now and say that, is it okay the way we have defined it, or does it require a new epistemology entirely? I mean, with not just the digital world, I mean, with also the AI and the world at war. I mean, we have, I mean, the level of violence, really, I mean, intolerance has kind of gone up several folds over the last 1 decade. If we just take that, a decadal growth.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. And right after the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, there was a flurry of activity in the newspapers condemning higher education as failing to meet its public purpose, and the inability to provide students with a moral compass to think through these issues. And almost all of the commentaries called upon leaders of higher education to return to the fundamental purposes of what it is that we do. And I think we do need to do that. We need to articulate the public and private purposes of higher education in this broader context. And in the US, over the past year, we've seen 71 bills introduced in 22 states that would restrict speech and dictate the curriculum. And it's clear these legislative efforts are introduced in a post-truth era where controlling the narrative matters more than the facts. And they are bolstered by misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are becoming increasingly common. And, Scholars at Risk points to the fact that illiberal actors are using the language of rights, freedom, excellence to push forward their own targeted agendas that erode academic freedom and the autonomy of higher education institutions. So we need to pay attention to this existential threat that's posed to higher education and speak out about the importance of academic freedom, denounce attempts to control the curriculum and subvert the autonomy of colleges and universities, and to diminish this concept of higher education as a public good. If we don't do that, we're going to be in the position where we were in the McCarthy era, where the purging of academics took place, and into other times of national crisis in the civil rights movement and during the Vietnam War. So I think there's a real risk, and we need to talk about the ways in which higher education, as we conceive it, involves liberating the mind from past dispositions, entertaining the possibility that some of one's most fundamentally held beliefs might actually be mistaken, and positions one for success through engagement in larger questions. And that can't be done without the free exchange of ideas, the unfettered pursuit of the truth, and a willingness to speak across differences.
Thank you. Professor Spence, again, just pushing my question on the vocabulary. Robert Fisk, the historian, the Mideast correspondent for The Independent, in a very popular speech of his, talks about the cozy relationship between semantics and the cozy relationship between media and the government, and how editorials now sound more like press releases of the government. Now, I think the media has been, I'm a member of that, has been well documented and scrutinized of how they have played out. Has academia also lost its language of truth-telling? And is there a sense or a perception that you see across the world where academic leaders and academicians are ready to speak the language of power?
So look, there is no idealized sort of homostasis of a university. Universities are all sorts of different things. So I can only really talk about the universities in the system I know best, which is the universities of the UK. And to answer your question in a roundabout way, let's go back to the question of self-censorship. Remember that not only as a matter of moral and political philosophy, but also as a matter of law, the right to speak entails the right not to speak. And people self-censor for all sorts of reasons. They self-censor out of consideration of the feelings of others because they calculate that the political or social risk of expressing a view is too high, because they're not sure that this is an environment in which they want to experiment with a particular set of ideas, because they think that engagement with a particular set of ideas is threatening to their identity in some sort of way. And they ought to be allowed to self-censor. That's a right. That said, a lot of the sort of framing of your questions assumes students and staff who are keen to speak, and nasty university managers driven by corporate greed and the desire to maximize return to the university, silencing them, right? And I could look like one of those. As a good investigative journalist, you could read the New York Times and find out that I disinvited the Dalai Lama from the University of Sydney. I never disinvited the Dalai Lama from the University of Sydney. There's a huge kind of othering mythology here about university leaders and their role in this. The question is, do students, do academic staff have the courage to speak, even in contexts in which speech is sometimes difficult and avoids risk? And how do they weigh the particular bravery that it sometimes requires to speak against the personal, political, or social costs that there might be to them of speaking? And then in that environment, how do university leaders reduce those costs by encouraging everybody to engage in ways that are, to use Karen's word, and one that I know people contest, but that I actually think is really valuable, in ways that are civil, and in ways that are, in the best sense of the word, safe for them both in the university and more broadly. So I think I'd throw your question back about leadership back to our staff and students and say, do people have the courage to speak out? And then ask myself, what's my job to do to support them in doing that? But I've also got to respect their right to decide not to speak out, because I can't do the calculus of the cost to them more broadly of speaking. All I can do is try and create an environment where arbitrary costs associated with life at the university are reduced.
Thanks. I mean, no, I wasn't referring only to the leadership or the management of the university silencing the. I was talking about, a regular academic or anyone, a researcher or a journalist or a citizen, trying to be very careful. I mean, I see citizens now being very careful even on social media of what they post, because you suddenly get a enforcement directorate raid in your house for posting something. You get the government, sending a summon to you, even though you are actually not, within quotes, important enough for the government to really pay attention to. And things like this are forcing people, and particularly, and when in academic sphere, because they are speaking to a large cohort of students who have now the power or the agency to record what you're saying. And you're not really giving a structured speech inside a classroom. And that's what I'm also meant by the triggers. I'm speaking about violence. And then there is no way I'm going to be very careful of how I present a violent episode. And are we then slowly trying to silence ourselves? I'm not talking of the management trying to silence that, but it was just that. But You know,
And I think that's right. But speech has always been risky, right? I mean, there's never been there hasn't ever been a time when ideas have not been dangerous. And I think, as Karen suggests, the university, in the particular tradition that the universities on this call stand, has been a space in which experimentation with dangerous ideas has been more possible than it is in much of the surrounding culture. And that's a valuable thing. I think what we're all affirming on this call is that we feel some personal and collective responsibility to maintain the status of the university as a sandbox for the experimentation with dangerous ideas, recognizing the cost to that of both for us both as institutions and for members of staff and students personally, and in my for my part, not judging too harshly those who estimate the cost to be not worth the effort.
Thanks.
I think just to pick up on and link across both something that Michael said, and I think also that Karen mentioned earlier, because I think freedom of academic freedom is enshrined in our employment rights. And actually, if you look across, certainly at the University of Southampton, we've been thinking really carefully about our policies and our procedures, and to make sure that people have that support and have that protection that Michael was talking about. So we have all sorts of policies and procedures which actually would protect people's academic freedoms and give them and support. And we also have a set of behaviours, the Southampton behaviours. We've used the word collegiality as opposed to civility, which is very similar. So I think that as an employer, actually the UK universities are trying to create the spaces where people can express themselves freely and encourage that kind of deliberative democracy. But it's challenging, you know, and we have whistleblower policies, and we have reporting support tools and all sorts of things that we can put in place. And they can work both positively and negatively. And then we need to think through what does it mean if somebody is blowing a whistle on something? And we have to weigh all these things up.
And a lot of that there's a lot of making a meal of this, right? As I often say at work, saying I think that the people of X group are justified in using violence to overthrow Y group or whatever it might be. That is that's a moral claim that we can entertain at the university. Kill whoever the might be. That's not a moral claim that we can that we can justify at the university. That's a call to action. These distinctions are very hard to theorize, but most people in practice know exactly what they feel like.
Thanks. We have less than 10 minutes left for the session, and there are audience questions coming in. So I'm just going to read them out to you. One of our viewers asking that because communities persist in power structures, entrenched in power, how do we accommodate marginalized voices? A deliberative space functions on the premise that actors are engaging from positions of proportionate power. This is often not the case. Mainstream narratives, for example, will often find themselves overrepresented. And how do we correct this? Maybe I'll ask Professor PASQUERELLA to go for this question, or anyone else.
Yeah, it's such an important question. We need to engage in community conversations and listen critically and with understanding. And one of the ways that we can advance the listening of underrepresented voices is to just recognize those power structures and bring them to the fore. That one's positionality can have a chilling effect. And thinking about the past few comments, In the US, it's a very different context. So academic freedom, while it is protected by Supreme Court decisions, doesn't seem to matter in certain states, because stare decisis, a respect for past precedent, has been upended by this current Supreme Court. And so the court had enshrined the right to for colleges and universities to hire who they wanted, to determine what gets taught in the classroom, to determine who gets admitted. And all of that has been undone by recent decisions. And so I think about the ways in which those voices are silenced by what has become a two-tier system. So if you are in certain states, you are proscribed from saying certain things. And so how do we allow those voices to be heard if you are going to be subject to over surveillance, if you are, as has been pointed out, going to be recorded and then turned in and silenced? And so we need to pay attention to, I think what was suggested earlier quite brilliantly, that we all need to work together to speak out in support of the rights of those who are being marginalized and who are being silenced right now, work together as associations and as independent academics to decry what's happening in higher education around the world.
Can I just add to
Jane's
that?
point, sorry, I was just going to say quickly, Jane's point is a really important one here. What is a minority voice is partly defined by the broader community, but it also will partly depend upon the culture of the particular academic community, relevant academic community. So it might be the community of a department or of a faculty or of an institution, as much as of the community as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Just on the point that you're ending on, Lynn, and something I alluded to, I think universities are very different beasts in different jurisdictions, and corporate governance really matters, the structures as well as the practices. We've been talking more about practices and structures, and that's very different. Nevertheless, I think there is a very strong sense among university staff and presidents of transnational solidarity around certain kind of core moral issues. I remember a little while ago when I was working at Oxford, being part of a campaign for the Central European University that was under relentless attack through kind of bureaucratic reform, actually, but it was a silencing from the Hungarian government. It subsequently relocated to Austria. And so it was, wasn't a successful campaign, but I think it was nevertheless important that we had that campaign where we see individual universities under assault. And I think in our Zoom age, in what we're doing now in our social media age, there is a role and a space for a kind of transnational dialogue, which will allow some minority voices to be heard that can't be heard within their own jurisdiction. So I think it's just thinking more holistically and transnationally about what we can do across borders. Can be quite powerful. I think it can be good for morale. It can actually sometimes translate into, we have our Council for Refugee Academics that places academics here in the UK, has done since the Nazis. So I think there is something around what we can do as universities to universities that symbolises and models those values and stands up for those marginalised individuals.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's more important than ever because of the skyrocketing moral distress that campus leaders are experiencing, where they feel coerced into making decisions they believe are unethical, but they feel they have no choice.
Yeah, there was one last question from the audience. I'm not very sure we have time to take it, but I think we have deliberated on that, on how can universities really make a difference when political masters and social media and organization culture and values come into play. How can we walk the talk rather than talk the talk? But, at the same time, what some of you mentioned, that autonomy cannot go without accountability. And, it's important to balance really academic freedom with the need of the universities to demonstrate accountability towards its stakeholders. Thank you so much. But I wanted to, quote Arif Ahmed when he first took over, and he was quoting an American judge, Brandis, writing in 1927, I think in concurrence, effectively defending a communist who had been arrested after she gave a speech attacking a racist lynch mobs. And I think it's, appropriate and telling the what Judge Brandes says, those who won our independence, he wrote, believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government and deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly discussion would be futile, that with them discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is the political duty, and that should be the fundamental principle. And I think it should also be a fundamental principle when we think about all our students and our duties, because, you know, we are educating students and educating ourselves to become not only nurses and scientists and architects and lawyers, but also citizens of democracy, which is under attack. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I am enriched, and I hope readers and viewers will, have watched this, learn from this, and they'll go back and watch this again. Thank you so much.